So I think that trends in fiction all reflect the real world events that are going on at the time. And I think that as the world seems to be growing through a period of increasing turbulence, increasing uncertainty, all of us are scared. None of us know what's going on. We all feel very powerless. One of the primary purposes of fiction is escapism, and especially with fantasy subgenre. And I think that what we all need right now are the things that cozy fantasy offers: that sense of safety, of security, of community, the reassurance that everything is going to be all right, that there are people who love you, that things will get better.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I am your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. So welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am super excited that you are here with me today. First, just a quick update on my Kickstarter. If you listened to last week's episode with Janetta Penner, you would have heard that I am running a Kickstarter for my own cozy fantasy novel, The Bartender Between Worlds. It is a special edition hardcover version of the book, but there's also paperback copies and ebook copies as well that you can unlock during this campaign. As I mentioned last week, this campaign has gone far better than I could have ever imagined, and I just want to thank everyone listening who has gone and checked out the Kickstarter. I'm doing this brief intro just to let you know that the campaign is still ongoing, and we have unlocked the audiobook tier. The audiobook stretch goal, I should say, is we hit a level where I'm able to get an audiobook produced for The Bartender Between Worlds, and anyone who backs at any tier level will get an audiobook included with their tier package, which I'm really excited that I'm able to do. Thank you for all of your support, and if you do enjoy cozy fantasy, if you enjoy drink recipes, definitely check out The Bartender Between Worlds. Hit up the YouTube video on my channel if you want to see the gold foil hardcover special edition that I'm holding up. There's lots of cool things on here. I've unlocked illustrated chapter headings, which I've yet to announce. My wife has also done some beautiful illustrations in here, which you can see on the Kickstarter page. And there's drink recipes. So the special edition is going to have additional drink recipes that the standard market edition will not have. So it's definitely something that you want to check out. Head over to that page, and even if you don't back the campaign, that's completely fine, but I'd love for you to check it out. Also, I would really love if you would hit like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice, whether that's Spotify or whether you're watching this on YouTube. Even if you are listening on your podcast app, if you could head over to YouTube and hit subscribe on my channel, that would help me out immensely. I'm still hovering below 100 subscribers on the channel, and anything that we can do to help the YouTube algorithm get these videos out in front of more listeners would be absolutely fantastic. This podcast does actually take quite a bit of time for me to put together. I know it's a conversation, but there's a lot that goes behind the scenes in editing and that. And views and listens have been down a bit in the last couple of weeks. And I know it's not just me, because I have other friends in the space as well who have said the same thing. Hitting like, especially on YouTube, goes a long way. Leaving reviews on Spotify or Apple definitely helps as well. And definitely, if you would like to see more interviews or listen to more interviews with me and other authors, that is just a great and free way to help support me and the work that I do here. But I want to thank you for being here with me today. I've got my interview with Marshall Moore coming up, and we have a great chat about his cozy fantasy book, Son of a Sailor. So stick around, and we will get right to the interview. So welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am so excited to have a very special guest with us today. Welcome here, Marshall Moore.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So Marshall, can you get us started and just tell us a little bit about your writing journey and what has brought you to this point in your writing career?
Yeah, so at present, I have 5 novels currently published alongside about 30 short stories. I first turned my attention towards writing professionally in about 2019 when I'd written several novels prior to that and did the whole querying process, getting rejected and all that. And around 2019, I turned my attention to short stories, which really sharpened my skill set because everything you need to learn about writing, storycraft, and narrative for a longer piece can be distilled into a short story. But you have so much of a shorter word count, you've really got to learn economy of phrase and economy of narrative function. So I started that in 2019. 2020, most of my jobs were in more of a public facing space. So I was basically, trapped in lockdown
Mm.
and turned my attention towards, just focusing on my writing for that time. And in 2021, I met with my publisher for my first book, The Pale City, which is a necromancy murder mystery. Pitched it to them. They said, we love it, but we don't do standalones. Can you make it a series? So I made it a trilogy. Those came out in 2022 and 2023. And then also in 2023, I published my first self-published book, Son of a Sailor, a pirate cozy fantasy, and also its sequel, Prisoners of a Pirate Queen, later on that year.
Very cool. So, had you been writing your entire life, and you just had kind of started the publishing process at that time?
Yeah, so I definitely came to writing pretty early. Basically, as soon as I learned how to read, I was like, well, I can do this. With the utter boundless confidence while 6-year-old.
Right.
Yeah. So I was just making up stories in my whole life, and they obviously got better as I grew in both skill and maturity. And all through my teen and my 20s, I was working on manuscripts. I think I finished my first complete novel manuscript in 2015 or 16 when I was 24 or 25.
Nice.
Complete garbage, did the querying process, but the common wisdom that I've heard is that every writer has a million bad words in them that you've got to get out
Right.
before you're going to get any good words. And so,
Yes.
all the 3 manuscripts in my, trunk, manuscript graveyard, whatever you want to call it, helped me get to this point. So, like I said, it was about 2019 when I was transitioning out of my previous focus had been on the film industry. I decided to go a different route and turn my focus to writing. And the pacing at which my skill grew at that point was just astronomical compared to how it had been sort of just plugging along prior to that.
Right. Okay. Very cool. And so, why is storytelling being such a big part of your life?
Hmm.
What's the motivation behind your writing?
I'm going to attribute that to my parents, probably. They were
Okay.
they're both very strong storytellers in very different ways. Whenever I think of what my earliest memory of books and stories and fantasy in particular, I always go back to my mom reading me the Chronicles of Narnia when I'm a little kid. That's
Nice.
my foundational cornerstone. Books opening a whole different world of possibilities to me. So that's from my mom's side. She loved reading to us. And then my dad was a very avid outdoorsman, fisherman, sportsman, and so just he could spin a tale out of his own adventures. And so from either side of my parents, I grew up with just this very ingrained sense of the best way to empathize with other people is to share narratives with them.
Right. Yeah. So was that your kind of your motivation towards going into towards the filmmaking side of things? You said that that's kind of the direction you had started.
Yeah. So yes, in a broad sense. Basically, film came about as an interest for me because when I was about 13 years old, I grew up on U.S. military bases until that point, and then we moved to the mainland United States and into a medium-sized town in the southeast. And no one enjoys being 13. That's a rough age,
Right.
especially when you're not dealing with that amount of culture shock. But what got me
Yeah.
out of that, post-moving shock was I got into local theater, and that really opened up I'd always been an imaginative kid, and I was always playing make-believe or role-playing games when I was getting older. And theater really just opened up that sense of oh, you can be anyone. You can tell a story as another person. And
Right.
it sort of progressed naturally from there into film. I majored in theater with a film minor in college and moved to LA right after graduation to try and make it as a filmmaker out there. Did not pan out, but obviously
Right.
it all worked out for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's really cool. So you mentioned the Chronicles of Narnia. Are there any other authors who have inspired you in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say probably the 2 that come right to mind are Neil Gaiman, for one.
Nice.
His prose style and sort of his body of work are both things that I really strive to, if not emulate, then are sort of good roadmaps for the sort of writer I want to be, if that makes sense.
Nice.
He's
Yeah,
got such an
absolutely.
engaging, distinct voice and a distinct tone to everything he writes. And while I don't
Hmm.
want to, obviously copy or do the same thing as him, that specificity and intentionalness of what he's trying to accomplish with each of his books really speaks to me, as well as his broad range of, like, he's got a bunch of standalone novels. He's got, the groundbreaking graphic series in The Sandman. He's got adaptations of his work that he's produced. Just the fact
Yeah.
that he has his fingers in so many pies, that appeals to me a lot, rather than just sort of pigeonholing yourself into one thing. And then the other one, sort of in the opposite direction, is Jim Butcher is one of my all-time favorites. Love the Dresden
Okay.
Files. And just the fact that he created this character in this world that are basically his personal playground, where he can just go off and tell the stories that he loves and that are going to be entertaining both for the reader, but also, just as importantly, for the writer. That's something I really try and keep in mind, because if writing ever starts feeling like work, then it's like, why are we doing it?
Definitely. Yeah, I hear you there. Is there a particular game work that you kind of look at as kind of your favorite, or is it just kind of more the breadth, like you mentioned, the breadth of his work?
There are two. So the first one, Neverwhere, that is,
Okay.
for those who don't know, that's his sort of like urban fantasy. Man falls into the London beneath London, where time is all wibbly wobbly and there's magic, and just fantastic archetypal hero's journey. But I read that as I was doing a semester abroad in college in London. So,
Oh,
like, the
nice.
main character, yeah, exactly, and that was my first game in as well. So, like, you, that had a major impact on me, as well, and just the way that the main character is both like struck with the awe and wonder of this new world that is and is not the London he knows. It really, like, resonated with me, because at that time I was like, this is exactly how I'm feeling about this huge, bold new city that I've never been to. So
Right.
that really
Yeah,
struck
I
a
bet.
chord. Yeah. And then the other one is Stardust. And that one, again, another typical hero's journey, beautifully written. But also, I watched the movie version of it the night that my wife and I got together for the first time. So
Oh,
it's
nice.
got a very special
Yeah,
place in my heart for that.
of
That's
course.
big.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one to replicate as far as importance goes in in your journey.
Yeah.
That's the case, right? Cool, very cool. So now you talked a little bit about this, I think, with looking at Gaiman and the breadth of his work. But you did have a shift in genres from your first series to your more recent works. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why you moved to cozy fantasy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Pale City and its sequels, the Ashen City and the Awoken City, those are all pretty traditional high fantasy, or I like to say that they're high fantasy wearing an urban fantasy trench coat, because, like, they're a secondary world and, like, very, you know, high fantasy level of magic system and that kind of thing. But it is very much a, like, murder mystery being central to each of the plots, and, the first person hard boiled detective narration. Son of Sailor came about because a basically, my wife asked me, "Hey, cozy fantasy is really big right now. Would you ever consider doing one?" And I said, "I don't know. It's not really my thing." Because at that point, I'd read a few. I'd read Legends and Lattes, one or two other ones. I was like, I enjoy them, but, like, I don't know that I could ever see myself writing this. Like, I'm an action adventure kind of guy. This isn't my brand. So,
Yeah.
I thought about it for a little while, and then, like, the next time, like, texting her, I'm like, okay, it's gonna be cozy fantasy, but it's pirates and it's Jimmy Buffett and they're all on an island. It came about from there. And
Yeah.
just the more I started writing it, the more I really found myself enjoying it, because there's something about just the more everyone says, like, low key and low stakes, and that is part of it. But just the fact that, by virtue of it not being, like, all high action, high octane adventure constantly, you spend more time with the characters and their interior life and their feelings and relationships with each other. And I found that that was a space that I really enjoyed exploring, and that
Nice.
the fact that the genre encourages a sort of gentleness in the way that people interact with each other, um, it's reaffirming, right? Like, you want
Mhm.
to be able to believe the best of people, and cozy fantasy, I think, really allows us a space to do that, both for the people in our lives and for ourselves.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I have been reading Son of a Sailor,
Oh, thank you.
and I have to say, the emotion that you capture in the character as he's returning home and that sort of thing is just incredible. So
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. Now, like, did you have any difficulty in kind of going from that action adventure into the slower pace and having to explore those emotions a little more fully, or was it something that kind of came quite naturally as you were working on it?
So it's an interesting question, and I think that the pacing definitely is the thing that is the biggest challenge to change. And I think if I had to, like, pick a weakness of Son of a Sailor, it's that the pacing is a little bit slower than, even, like, if I was to take another pass at it today, a year after I published it, then I might find a way to tighten that up a little bit.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a short book, so like it doesn't drag too terribly much, but I definitely see pacing issues.
Okay.
I think it all part of the challenge with cozy is that you want there to still be some sort of sense of urgency. It doesn't need to be as much of a ticking clock as you would get in a more fast-paced storyline, but there still has
Right.
to be some sort of like deadline rather than the characters just wandering or some sort of external this has to happen by this point or
Right.
whatever and that doesn't even necessarily have to be like chronological. Like I'm trying to think back to Legends and Lattes and like the fact that she's like struggling to open the coffee shop and there's like money issues involved like that can serve as a ticking clock as well. Like so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that the one thing that was the biggest challenge was finding a way to balance the pacing. I do think I got a lot better at it in Prisoners of the Pirate Queen, the sequel,
Mhm.
which is it occupies a little bit of a weirder niche because it's still very much the same tone, but I wouldn't qualify it as cozy necessarily. Same characters,
Okay.
same world, but a little more action adventure. They're having actual pirate adventures as opposed to the first one, which is a lot more personal and meditative.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then, so when you, I guess, moving from kind of the action adventure fantasy that you have in your first series, moving to cozy fantasy, did you ever consider writing under a different pen name to go into a different subgenre, or was that never a thought?
No, it was never a thought. I mean, so like part of my understanding of like marketing for authors is that your name is your brand essentially, and for
Yeah.
some people they might want very specific separate brands. If you're writing you know action adventure high fantasy but also like hardcore monster smut on the side, you might want to separate out those first. I've met several
Right.
people who that's exactly their business mode.
Right.
um,
Yes.
yeah, but there's no monster smut in my books. Just gonna clarify that for the viewers and listeners right now. But high fantasy, action adventure, and cozy fantasy, they're under the general fantasy umbrella enough that I had never felt the need to differentiate them, and also the fact that the subject material of Son of a Sailor, with its themes of grief and homegoing and community, were so personal to me that like it would have felt so disingenuous to stamp any name but my own on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've talked a little bit around it. Can you tell us a little bit more about Son of a Sailor and what it's all about?
Yes, absolutely. So, Son of a Sailor is a cozy pirate fantasy. It follows the infamous pirate Captain Redbeard, who is known to the folk of his island hometown of Ember Bay as Quint Thatch, the tavern keeper's son. Everyone on his hometown island has no idea whatsoever that he's a pirate. He hasn't been back in several years, but he gets tragic news that his father has passed away and goes back home to reconnect with the family and friends that he left behind, fix up his dad's sailboat, and sort of lay to rest his legacy. And then his crew shows up unexpectedly with the Navy in hot pursuit, captained by his old flame. So he has to find a way to save his crew and reconcile both halves of his identity.
Yeah, cool. One thing that I really love about the story is that your traditional fantasy story is kid grows up in a small town and it's about his adventure leaving the small town, and this is really kind of the opposite of that. He's had his adventure and he's coming back to the small town and seeing the small town through a different set of eyes, and I really did enjoy that aspect
Thank you.
of the story. Can you tell us, I guess, a little bit about what the inspiration behind the story was?
Yeah. So part of it is just me finding a way to find my own niche, essentially, in the cozy genre, because it's still growing and there's still room for it. But like
Hmm.
Legends and Lattes being the headliner, there are a lot of books out there that are very much following the mold of like character retires from traditional fantasy life, opens a caffeinated beverage shop, and I'm like, I don't want to just be another follow the leader there.
Yes.
I've got to find a way to make it my own, and part of that is the setting. Like nothing has been tropical so far, but what works for me directly with it is that the old adage to write what you know, which I firmly believe is about writing what you know emotionally rather than just limiting it to your lived experiences.
Hmm.
I grew up on a tiny tropical island in a very small
Right.
community. I lost my father unexpectedly at 17, and
Hmm.
that grief has defined the entirety of my adult life. And
Right.
so when I was like, okay, this has to be cozy, it has to be low stakes, and it has to be emotionally raw and open and genuine, the only natural choice there was I'm going to write about grief. I'm going to write about grief over losing a parent. I'm going to write about living in this idyllic, tiny tropical island and the community that surrounds you and how community will uplift you and heal you through that loss.
Hmm. Yeah, cool. Yeah, and I think that comes through, and it definitely speaks to the depth of the emotion of the character. Because I
Thank
think,
you.
I mean, it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely, you can definitely, it's definitely there. Um, Now, how much of your the community that you grew up in, how much of that is actually worked into the story? Is there a lot of it actually based on where you grew up, or is it kind of just more of a loosely based?
I mean, the general vibe, I would say,
Yeah.
more than like any specifics. There are one or two characters in there who are pretty directly tied to real life people, but I don't want to, name names or give anyone
No, of
away.
course not. Of
I
course
will
not.
say that the main character's mom is definitely a love letter to my own mother. They're alike in a lot of ways. They're different in a lot of ways too, but like
Mm,
that's um, she's one of the strongest people I know, and after losing her husband, my main character's mom also had to have that similar tenacity of spirit and the ability to just sort of build that community around her to uplift her.
right.
But a lot of the like, I'm trying to think of how to best phrase it. Uh, the sensory details, almost like just the overall atmosphere of the island setting, that is all directly drawn from my personal experience, and just
Right.
I'm just going to transpose where I grew up onto this fictional island, and we're going to go from there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And have you had the experience, I guess, of going back as an adult and having kind of that experience that your main character did?
No, I've not. So that is actually sort of
Okay.
part of the wish fulfillment aspect of the
Okay.
fantasy for me. Because the island where I grew up is a military base. It's part of the Marshall Islands, which is actually why
Mm.
they named me that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but the U.S. has a missile range there that they've had since World War II, and so that's why I was born there and why I grew up there. But
Mm.
it's a little hard as a civilian adult to find a way back there unless you're like
Right.
sponsored by someone who's currently out there. So it hasn't happened yet. It's on my bucket list for sure. I would love to go back.
Okay. Yeah. Not so much a tourist destination then.
No, not really.
Cool. So why do you think it is that cozy fantasy is having its day? What is it about the low stakes that draws in its readers?
So I think that trends in fiction all reflect the real world events that are going on at the time. And I mean, if you look again, harkening back to Legends and Lattes as sort of the flagship for the subgenre, Travis Baldree wrote that during NaNoWriMo during COVID. When he was
Right.
longing for the simple joy of going into a coffee shop and having community at a coffee shop, and I think that as the world seems to be growing through a period of increasing turbulence, increasing uncertainty, all of us are scared. None of us know what's going on. We all feel very powerless. One of the primary purposes of fiction is escapism, and especially with fantasy subgenre, as Tolkien says on fairy stories essay. And I think that what we all need right now are the things that cozy fantasy offers: that sense of safety, of security, of community, the reassurance that everything is going to be all right, that there are people who love you, that things will get better.
Yeah. Did you find that that applied it for you personally as well as you shifted from your kind of high stakes? Did you find it was kind of a nice break from the high stakes fantasy that you were writing before?
Yeah, honestly, absolutely. It, yeah, it just it felt good. Like it's much more humorous than my previous trilogy. It's hard to keep the reader's attention in low stakes unless you have a lot of humor sprinkled throughout. And
Hmm.
I was honestly surprised because I never considered myself a funny writer, but the more I found opportunities to like I can sprinkle this joke in here and like getting feedback from my betas that like they actually like the humor I'm putting in there. I'm like, oh, this is actually really fun, and like I think it's important. Every book is a different challenge, and the trilogy I'd gone through was pretty grim, pretty serious. High dramatic stakes, and the ability to just write something that was fun was such a game changer for me, and just reinvigorating my love for the craft and the experience.
Hmm. Yeah, really cool. And I know you've talked a little bit about the island already. Is there anything else that you can tell us about the universe of Son of the Sailor and Prisoners of the Pirate Queen? I guess that you haven't talked about, and what was the most enjoyable part about creating the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the reason that I decided to go to the secondary world is just the freedom that it offers. It's very so the first book takes place almost entirely on Ember Bay, which is the island where Quinn, the main character, grew up and that comes back to. The second one expands it a little more. I'm not going to give away spoilers because I don't want to ruin what happens in it, but like they do get
Yeah.
off. They get a little more wide ranging, a little more outside of the zone. But it's written in the way that a lot of fantasy is, where I'm trying to at least mimic or ape the aesthetics of a particular time period. So obviously, this is a pirate book. I'm trying to play off all the golden age of piracy, late 1600s, early 1700s, that aesthetic, those tropes. It's a big archipelago. I think that I've never This is something I kind of regret for myself as the writer. I never named the empire; it's just the empire. So now I'm like, oh, if there are other nations out there, I've you know made up fantasy name and the empire. A little bit
Right.
weak on the world building there, in my opinion. But yeah, it's basically the Caribbean writ large, and I think that
Okay.
Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series was a big influence on me, and the fact that
Oh,
her
nice.
world map for that one is like it is the archipelago. It's not the one in my book is different, but like the fact that it's just nothing but islands. There's no landmass larger than like Great Britain, and I
Right.
kind of envision similarly for this. I haven't committed to a
Yeah.
map because I can't draw, and also I don't want to limit myself geographically with the setting.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, basically just the Caribbean on a much larger scale.
Yeah. Okay. And then you also talked about it being a secondary world. There's mythical creatures in here. I don't know how too far into the story you want to want to get in talking about it. Can you tell me just though a little bit more about that idea and bringing in that a little bit of mythology and fantasy into it?
Yeah, so I love world building, and there are always questions you have to ask yourself, especially when you're doing secondary fantasy world building. And
Hmm.
one of the ones I settled on pretty early is that I didn't want this to be a magic setting, or at least if there is any magic, it's going to be extremely low and extremely subtle.
Okay.
Um, Largely because, like I said, I'm trying to mimic the aesthetic and setting of the Age of Sail as much as I can. And the moment you introduce magic to a setting, you have to consider what the ramifications of that magic are. Like even if it's limited to
Yeah.
like like D&D, the create water spell exists. Okay, that opens up so many new avenues for irrigation and public health. Like just that one thing is going to
Hmm.
completely reshape the way a society functions. So the more
Right.
of those options you have, the more you have to reconsider how it's going to affect your overall world building. So I didn't want magic, but I do have mermaids. They are not your traditional, sexy lady on the beach mermaid. They're very reptilian. The main one that appears in the books, she's basically like a snaky version of Stitch from Lilo and Stitch. She's got huge black eyes and too many teeth, and is desperate to drown a human man. And she's everyone's favorite character. She's amazing. But that was kind of my way to both insert a little bit more of a fantastical element, and it's a pirate book, and so as much as I'm sticking to the aesthetic of the Age of Sail, I also want to make sure that I'm throwing in the here there be monsters,
Right.
edge of the map, uncharted feelings as well.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And so, how did you come about creating a mer person that was different than the traditional view of what a mermaid is?
Yeah. So her role in the book, largely, or at least in part, is to sort of serve as the audience surrogate, in the same way that Bilbo's the audience surrogate for The Hobbit. Getting out into the
Mm,
wider world and experiencing these things that are known to the dwarves and Gandalf. Lurk, my mermaid, is sort of like, but why do humans do X, Y, Z? Like she's my little window into like letting my main character exposit about the world they live in, or also just externalize his internal processes of emotion while he's coping with this grief and this homecoming and all of his stuff. She's the voice he can talk to for that.
right.
And
Yeah.
I want one of the important things, because there is, I wouldn't say there's so much of a romance subplot in this book, but there is a little bit of an element with his old flame that shows up later on. I wanted to make sure there was no hint of like sexual tension between him and the mermaid, so I made her as just
Right.
unsexy, like untraditional hot mermaid woman as possible. Like she's a weird feral little snake creature.
Okay.
And just it was a delight. And their relationship is much more like almost parental, and it really warms me in that way.
Yeah. Fun. That's really cool. Uh, was there anything challenging about creating the world for you?
The world really wasn't.
Okay.
It's not as so. The first series I had, the Pale City and its sequels, um, I approached it from a world building standpoint. Like the core conceit of that series is that it takes place in a city where whenever someone dies, their body gets repurposed into a zombie servant. So my
Okay.
core story question there was like, what does a society founded on necromancy look like?
Mm,
This one was a very much more character focused book. It's about Quinn. It's
yeah.
about his grief. It's about his experience as rediscovering his community. So the world itself, I was able to paint in much more broad strokes, which honestly allows me a lot more freedom as a writer to just sort of, I can add in details where needed. This is again part of why I don't make a map for it. It's easier for me to just, say, oh, and then there's this other island over here where they, have X natural resource or whatever.
Hmm. Was there anything challenging, I guess, in general then in creating the story?
Like I said earlier, pacing was probably the
Oh,
most
yeah.
like, okay, I've got to figure out a way to like keep this from dragging. And there was definitely at least one or two scenes that I ultimately ended up cutting just because like they were fun and they were very like aesthetically pleasing, but they nothing happened in them that couldn't have been summarized in a paragraph in a different chapter.
Okay.
Trying to think if there were any other particular challenges with it. Um, Overall, it was honestly part of the easiest book I've ever written. I had the first draft finished in 6 weeks, which is a
Nice.
crazy amount of time.
Yeah.
Um, no, the sequel provided some challenges, largely in that like I literally got to the end of it and said that didn't work, and then like went back and figured out like what elements specifically needed changing. Basically, turned out that I had put some. I had the wrong character focus on the wrong secondary characters for the B plots and
Uh,
C plots, and so I basically
okay.
just had to swap those around. But that's part of the joy of
Okay.
the process is once you find out what you've done wrong, it's easier to go back and fix it than to just have started over from scratch essentially.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes you need to go through the process of the story to figure out what in the story isn't working. I don't know if are you an outliner or do you pants your stories?
I am an outliner, and even
Okay.
then, sometimes it doesn't work. I'm actually, I just came to the realization this week. I'm working on the third book right now, and I realized that the overall plot I had set for it just wasn't working. So
Hmm.
I'm throwing out 60,000 words and going back to the drawing board,
Oh, that's
which,
painful.
yeah, I know it's rough, but like I
Yeah.
figured out why and what's not working, and like the A plot didn't work for it, but I figured out the overall arcs I had set for each character for their growth, those are still solid. So like I just need to work
Okay.
them into a different main plot, which is
Right.
much more freeing, rather than continuing to hack away at a book that I'm not loving.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great that you figured that out at some point in the process and are
Yeah,
able to go back and fix it. But that is a painful
yeah, it is.
experience to throw out that many words, right?
Yeah, but I'm also not
Um,
the first. I've had a few friends who have had to throw out entire manuscripts and start
yeah,
over from the beginning. So at least I was only halfway through it.
right. Yeah, it's a reality of the process, right?
Hmm.
So now Pale City was traditionally published. That's correct.
Yes.
Um, yeah, and you decided to self-publish Son of a Sailor. I guess why? What was the reasoning for going towards a self-published model, and how was the process different between the two?
So it was basically speed. Like I said, I wrote
Okay.
Son of a Sailor very quickly. The timeline for it was, like I said earlier, my wife asked me, like, would I ever write a cozy fantasy? And I was like, no, never. And then the next day I was texting her about Jimmy Buffett. And that was in late January of 2023, like the
Hmm.
very tail end of the month. And so, like, when I had the idea, we were like, okay, I think we can publish this by Labor Day weekend and get it out, like, for the summer, be a summer read.
Hmm.
So I had a very tight timeline to work on there. And traditional publishing, Pale City and sequels are published by Shadow Alley Press, which is a small press. But even then, the timeline between me signing the contract and then publishing the first book was still like an 18-month process. And
Right.
if I
Yeah.
wanted, to hop on the cozy train and to have it be a very summary book, I needed to have it written and out in the world in under 4 months. And
Yeah.
self-publishing was the only option that would allow me that speed and flexibility.
Okay. Was self-publishing an option that you had considered for Pale City, or was that something that hadn't hit your radar yet?
Hadn't entered my brain at all.
Okay. um, and so, what's it been like, kind of seeing the two sides of the industry?
It's been good. I really enjoy working with Shadow Alley. They're great people, great publisher. I do also like just the greater flexibility I am afforded with Son of a Sailor and its sequels, just in terms of like what I can do with the marketing and like just being able to make decisions myself instead of having to ask somebody.
Hmm.
But they've both been great experiences. They're both really good. I'm currently in process on querying a manuscript to agents for like a other trad publisher
Okay.
experience. So soon I'll have all three sides. Hopefully, knock on wood: the
Right.
self pub,
Yeah.
the small press, and the mainstream.
Yeah. Very cool. I hope that works. That works out for you.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Um, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your character. I know we've discussed him a little bit, but can you tell me a bit more about the idea for him, how he came about, and what his motivations are?
Yeah. So Quentin Thatch, aka Captain Redbeard, is the main character of Some Sailor. Um, and like I said, his interior emotional journey is very much drawn from real life experience with the grief and the community aspect of it.
Mm.
But it's like I said earlier, it's important for me that stories come from a place of emotional honesty and genuineness. But also you need to not make every character a complete self insert, right? Like if
Yeah.
this is just me in fantasy world, it becomes a power trip immediately, and that's not a narrative that I'm interested in writing or reading
Hmm.
for that matter. So Quint is he's got some similarities to me, but he's a much better version of myself in a lot of ways. Like
Okay.
he's a natural leader. He's very charismatic, and he's very just caring towards everyone who comes into his orbit. He basically just adopts people. Like that's sort of how his relationship with the mermaid starts. Like
Hmm.
she tries to drown him and doesn't do it, and then he's like, okay, well, I guess we're gonna be friends now. He's very caring. He's very dutiful. And he's got the inner conflict of he loves his family, he loves his mom, he loves his hometown, but he also wants to keep them separate from the whole piratical side of his life, which is most of his adulthood now.
Hmm.
So he's got that whole. Every story has to be about the character's inner conflict in some way. George R. R. Martin
Yeah.
says that the only thing worth writing or reading is the human heart at war with itself. And so every character has to have their inner conflict, and his is finding a way to balance the dichotomy of these two halves of his identity. Himself as the
Right.
dutiful son, and himself as the pirate captain. And
Hmm.
that's a really fun fertile ground, both for some interesting emotional development, but also it's a fun uh, way to play with people's perceptions. Like the people in his hometown see him one way, the people on his crew see him as another way, the people in the
Right.
Navy who come to arrest him see him in a completely other way.
Hmm.
And so finding both the difference between the perceptions of the character, both from others and himself, and the actual person whose head we're inhabiting it gave me a lot of fun space to play with.
I bet. So how do you approach writing a character like that? Because obviously those are, he's coming home as as a son that and they think he's doing one thing, but his real life is a pirate. As a writer, do you approach handling that dichotomy between the two sides of the character?
So it's what it really always comes down to, because he doesn't really act very differently with anyone. It's about making sure that the central identity of the character, the real person who we're experiencing the story alongside because we're in his head, is the same throughout. Like the
Mm,
perceptions are different, but it's all because he's crafted himself to be viewed differently by different people. But as we follow him, we see no, he's exactly the same person the whole time. He's just being selective in what parts of his history he's allowing people to learn.
right. Yeah, and like you said, a lot of fun that you're able to work with there
Yeah.
and putting him in those different situations. So, what kind of emotional impact do you hope that readers have as they're going through these books?
So, like I said, I wrote this sort of as a memorial and an ode to my dad, and his passing and my grief over him. And loss is something that we're all going to deal with at some point in our lives. That's the trade-off of being human, is that to love means to lose.
Hmm.
And this story is for people who have experienced that, or are experiencing that, or are going to experience that, which means everyone. Um,
Yeah.
and it's about reminding you that you don't have to be alone. That there is community out there. There are people who will love you and will hold you tight through whatever hurt you're experiencing. And that's the core of all fiction, is finding some sort of central important message to communicate to your reader, to your audience. And
Yeah.
one of the most important ones for Cozy especially provides a wonderful vehicle for this, is that reminder that you are not alone, that you are loved, and that things will be okay.
Yeah, and I think, and that's why I feel like this book did resonate with me. Yeah, the emotional part of it, because I mean, I lost my father 10 years ago as well.
Sorry.
So him come, that's yeah. I mean, um, it is like you said, part of life and part of the experience that we go through. So reading those first chapters and the emotions that he's dealing with as he's coming home and seeing everyone, that definitely resonated with me. So I
I'm very glad.
definitely think that you the impact you wanted people to feel, you definitely incorporated it well.
And thank you. I'm really glad to hear that, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm sorry for for yours as well, and that's part of the journey, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you said you are working on book three.
Yep.
Is there anything else that you're working on, and what kind of can readers expect from you next?
So book 3 is currently in process. I'm debating whether or not to share the title. You can find it on the Amazon page. Book 3 is in process. Like I said, I just scrapped what I've got for it, so I'm coming out with fresh eyes this week. I'm also currently querying a gothic space fantasy to agents that is in process in the query trenches right now. Hopefully have more news on that later on. And then I'm ruminating on what I want to do after the third book. So my process right now is sort of, I want to I want to keep in the public eye. Like, I want to make sure I'm still putting out books, but I also, getting agented and trad-pubbed is one of my personal goals. So
Nice.
my current strategy going forward is I'm sort of alternating between like, pirate book or something else I can self-publish, something to pitch to agents, just kind of ping pong back and forth until one of those hits. So I've got a few ideas for the next one, but for now, pirate book number 3 is the current focus.
Nice. So yeah, so you've got a little bit of cozy and a little bit of action still to come. I like it.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Absolutely.
So Marshall, this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So can you tell us about how in a parallel universe, a different choice might have shaped another version of your life?
Yes. So I actually was thinking about this one earlier. So like I mentioned, I grew up on a tiny tropical island, and then we moved to the American Southeast. The other option, other than Alabama, for our family to move to was Alaska, which would have been a wildly different teen experience. Because I basically got stuck in like the most generic American middle class experience after 13 years on an island. And it would have been a very different life had we instead moved to Kodiak, Alaska, with the huge grizzly bears and the rugged outdoorsness and all of that. Because like I said, moving to Alabama was bizarrely enough how I found theater and then film, and then eventually transitioned all that into writing. I have no idea what I would have found to immerse myself in if we had moved to Alaska instead.
Yeah, right. And definitely those around you, your peers and that sort of thing at that age definitely influence, kind of your interest in that sort of thing. So 100%. Could it be wildly different?
Very. So that's my big what if alternate universe.
Yeah, I love it. And do you think that if you had gone that route, I mean, I know it's hard to say, it's all speculation, but do you think you'd still be writing?
I think so, because writing predated all that. Like I said, I learned basically as soon as I learned how to read, I was writing my own stories. So I think I would have eventually arrived at the same place, but probably with some very different stories in mind.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you wouldn't have had the experience to write Son of a Sailor. It'd be Son of a Trapper or something, something like that, right?
Yeah. It's Grizzly Man, but cozy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that'd be fun. Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Marshall. Can you let our listeners know how they can find you and where they can get a copy of your books?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. You can find me online at my website, which is marshalljmoore.com. I am most active on socials on TikTok or Instagram. You can find me at both of those under Marshall J. Moore Author. TikTok, I'm definitely more active. I post daily for as long as that is still going to exist in the U.S. We'll see. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to get more of an Instagram presence as well. You can find me under the same handle. Again, that's Marshall J. Moore Author on Threads, and Twitter at KWAJ14. That one didn't have enough characters to fit Marshall J. Moore Author.
I know that it didn't have enough for my name either. So, but thank you once again. I'll be sure to link all those in the show notes, and it was great chatting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.